He's just a businessman with a fancy suit. He won't actually touch me. You have no idea how much of you I already own. Imani didn't tremble when she walked down the aisle in her striking red and white gown. She trembled when Choi Sung-hyun leaned in, his dark tattoo visible against his neck, and whispered the one sentence that broke her resolve instantly. She knew her life had changed the moment her father bowed to that imposing man as if he were royalty rather than a monster. But it wasn't until they were alone in the private hotel suite, overlooking the Seoul skyline, that the cold truth finally cracked open. He wasn't just a husband. He wasn't just a solution to her father's debt. When he stepped into her space, his presence commanding the very air she breathed, she realized she hadn't been saved. She had been collateral, claimed for a purpose far more terrifying than a marriage certificate. Welcome back to Afro-Korean Story Space, besties. A huge shout out to Imani. I've used your name for our lead today just like you requested. Say hi in the comments right now if you are tuned in and watching. For my returning besties, you know how we do it. Make sure you watch until the very end, because if you stop in the middle of this story, you'll be up all night wondering what Sung-hyun's final demand really was. Drop a comment right now if you're already excited to see if Imani can survive the world of the Korean underground. The air in Seoul 3 months ago didn't feel like a death sentence. It felt like a dream Imani's father had finally caught. Imani remembered how her father, Marcus, had paced their living room in Kampala, talking about Korean gold and a trading scheme that would change their lives forever. He was a man of pride, a man who wanted to give his daughters the world, but in the glittering high-stakes shadows of South Korea, he was a small fish in a sea of sharks. He had traveled to Seoul seeking fortune, but instead, he found the cold reality of the underground trading markets. He had borrowed money he didn't have, $300,000, from the kind of men who didn't use banks to settle accounts. These were men like Kim Tae-won, whose names were whispered even in Uganda as warnings of what happens when you cross the wrong people. Imani had been with him on that trip, enjoying what she thought was a family vacation, until the night the hotel room door almost left its hinges. She could still see the terror on her father's face as 3 men in dark suits pushed their way in, their voices sharp and jagged as they spoke in Korean. Her father, a man she had always seen as a pillar of strength, had collapsed to his knees, bowing and scraping before them in a desperate plea for time. They didn't want time. They wanted their $300,000, or they wanted blood. They gave him 2 weeks to produce the money, threatening to fly to Uganda and burn their family home to the ground with her mother and sisters inside if he failed. The promise of wealth had turned into a promise of ash. Her father had sat on the edge of the hotel bed for hours, his head in his hands, weeping because he knew he was a dead man walking. It was then that the name Choi Sung-hyun first entered their lives. He wasn't like the thugs who had broken down the door. He was the shadow that controlled the thugs. He had appeared the following day, radiating a quiet, terrifying authority that made even the room's temperature seem to drop. He offered to pay every cent of the debt, but the price wouldn't be paid in currency. He looked at Imani with eyes that studied her like a prized acquisition and made his demand. The hotel room in Seoul still smelled of the expensive cigarettes the thugs had left behind, a lingering scent of the violence that was coming for them. Her father was a broken man, staring at the door as if expecting the flames to start licking the wood at any second. That was when Choi Sung-hyun appeared, not with a bang, but with a silence so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were bowing to him. He stepped into the room like a dark angel, his tailored black suit absorbing the dim light of the suite. He didn't shout and he didn't point weapons. He simply sat across from her father, crossing one leg with a grace that was both elegant and predatory. The dark, intricate tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse as he looked at the man who had gambled away his family's lives in an illegal trading scheme. Her father didn't just stand. He scraped and pleaded, his voice trembling as he realized he was no longer dealing with mere debt collectors, but with a man who ran the empire they served. Sung-hyun's eyes didn't stay on her father for long. They drifted to Imani, tracking her with a cold, calculated intensity that made the hair on her arms stand up. He spoke in perfect, deep tones, explaining that Kim Tae-won's men were already preparing to travel to Uganda. He described the fire they would set, the way her mother and sisters would scream, and the way her father would be forced to watch it all through a video screen before his own light was snuffed out. "I am the only wall between your home and the ash," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that felt like velvet wrapped around a blade. He offered a solution that was both a rescue and a kidnapping. He would pay the $300,000 immediately. He would ensure the men at the door never spoke her father's name again. But in exchange, he didn't want the money back. He wanted Imani. He demanded her as his bride, a permanent contract written in blood and silk. Her father didn't even look at her before he agreed, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a desperate rush to save his own skin. At that moment, as Sung-hyun's piercing gaze locked onto hers, Imani realized her father hadn't negotiated her safety. He had simply transferred her ownership. 6 weeks later, the humid air of Kampala was a distant memory, replaced by the sterile, biting chill of Seoul's private airport. Imani stepped off the plane with a new passport in her hand and the weight of her family's survival on her shoulders. She had left her mother and sisters in tears, the sound of their sobbing still echoing in her mind as she was whisked away in a black sedan with tinted windows. There was no room for mourning in this new life. There was only the contract. Inside the exclusive hotel suite, the air smelled of lilies and expensive floor wax, but to Imani it felt like a tomb. The women who dressed her were silent, moving with a clinical efficiency that stripped her of her last bit of agency. They pulled her hair into a sleek, low bun, pinning it so tight it felt like an anchor. Then they brought out the gown. It was a striking masterpiece of red and white, the heavy silk shimmering under the soft, golden lighting. To anyone else, the white symbolized purity and a new beginning, but to Imani, the crimson accents felt like a warning, a symbol of the danger she was walking into and the blood debt her father had signed in her name. As the stylist cinched the corset, Imani felt the breath leave her lungs. The dress wasn't a garment. It was a shroud. She stood before the full-length mirror, her skin glowing against the rich fabric, but her eyes reflected nothing but terror. Her pearl earrings trembled as she turned her head, catching the light like frozen tears. She looked elegant, refined, and completely hollow. She was a gift wrapped in silk, waiting to be delivered to a man who had bought her like cattle. Outside the door, the muffled sounds of the hotel's exclusive wing reminded her of where she was, thousands of miles from home, trapped in a gilded cage. She wasn't a bride preparing for a life of love. She was a sacrifice being prepared for an altar. When the heavy oak door finally creaked open, Imani didn't look up. She didn't need to. She could feel the sudden drop in temperature, the shift in the room's energy that signaled only one person had arrived. Choi Sung-hyun was here to claim what he had paid for. The chapel was an architect's dream of glass and cold marble, tucked away from the prying eyes of the Seoul elite, but to Imani, it felt like a high-end prison cell. As the doors swung open, the silence was absolute. There were no joyful whispers or rustling of guest programs. There was only the heavy, suffocating weight of an audience made up of men in dark suits who didn't look like wedding guests. They looked like sentries. Choi Sung-hyun stood at the end of the long aisle, a monolith of power in his perfectly tailored black suit. Even from a distance, the dark tattoo creeping up his neck served as a reminder that this was not a union of love, but a transaction of blood. His presence commanded the very air in the room, drawing every eye and silencing every breath. He didn't need to move or speak. He simply existed, and the room bent to his will. Beside Imani, her father took her arm, his hand shaking so violently she could feel it through the thick silk of her sleeves. As they reached the altar, Marcus didn't just hand his daughter over. He bowed. It wasn't the respectful nod of a father-in-law, but the frantic, deep bow of a servant to royalty, a desperate show of submission to the man who held his life in his hands. Imani felt a flash of cold disgust. Her father's freedom had been bought with her life, and he was thanking the buyer. Sung-hyun didn't look at Marcus. His piercing gray eyes were locked onto Imani, studying her under the golden lights like a prized acquisition. When he took her hand, his skin was cool, his grip firm and uncompromising. The ceremony was a blur of Korean and English words she barely processed, vows that felt like a death sentence being read aloud. She didn't feel like a bride. She felt like a piece of property being signed over to a new owner. There was no kiss of affection when the officiant finished. Instead, Sung-hyun leaned in, his cologne filling her senses, and pressed a cold, calculated kiss to her forehead. It was a public branding, a silent declaration to the room and to her that she had been claimed for something far more terrifying than marriage. As they turned to walk back down the aisle, the heavy red and white train of her dress hissed against the marble like a snake in the grass, a warning of the silence that was about to end and the reality that was about to begin. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving Imani alone in the private suite of Seoul's most exclusive hotel. The silence of the room was far more terrifying than the silent vows she had just exchanged. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering skyline of the city spread out like a sea of diamonds, a sharp and cold contrast to the warm, familiar streets of Kampala she had left behind. She stood in the center of the plush carpet, her dark fingers trembling against the delicate red and white silk of her gown. Every shadow in the room seemed to move, and every flicker of the golden lighting felt like a trap closing in. Her pearl earrings trembled slightly as she tilted her head, listening for any sound beyond the frantic thudding of her own heart. She was 18 years old and married to a man she had met only in the shadow of her father's failures. She felt like a stranger in her own skin, her braided hair adorned with crystals that felt like heavy weights, her makeup a flawless mask for the terror living in her brown eyes. She thought of her passport, now in his possession, and her family's safety back in Uganda, which depended entirely on her cooperation. She was trapped in a gilded cage in a foreign country, sold to settle debts her father owed to dangerous people. The luxury of the suite, the scent of expensive cologne and the soft glow of the lamps did nothing to ease the ice running through her veins. Then the sound came. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. The rhythmic, steady click of polished shoes against the marble floor of the outer hallway. Each step was a countdown, moving with the grace of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. The handle of the bedroom door turned with a slow, deliberate click. Imani backed toward the window, the wedding dress feeling like chains wrapped around her body. Choi Sung-hyun entered the room, and the air seemed to vanish, even without the tailored black suit he had worn at the altar. He moved with a discipline and power that made her breath catch in her throat. He didn't look like a man burdened by age. He looked like a man who owned the night. His piercing eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, Imani realized that the shattered world her father had warned her about was standing right in front of her. Sung-hyun didn't just walk into the room. He dominated it. He moved with a silent, feline grace that made the spacious suite feel suddenly, dangerously small. As he unbuttoned his suit jacket, the movement revealed the powerful breadth of his shoulders and the controlled tension in his frame. He wasn't the frail, aging man Imani had tried to convince herself he would be. He was a predator in the prime of his power, radiating a terrifying vitality that made her knees feel weak. Imani backed away until the cold glass of the window pressed against her spine. The Seoul skyline glittered behind her, but her world was narrowed down to the man advancing toward her. Her breath came in shallow hitches, her chest rising and falling beneath the restrictive silk of her bodice. She tried to maintain her dignity, to keep her chin high as she had been taught, but her pearl earrings betrayed her, clicking softly against her jaw as she trembled. "You look like a cornered deer, Imani," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to hum in the very air between them. He stopped just inches away, his shadow completely swallowing her. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloped her, a masculine fragrance that felt like a claim. Is this the part where you tell me I'm too old to be your husband? Where do you tell yourself you're safe because of the years between us? He reached out, not with a strike, but with a slow, deliberate movement that was infinitely more frightening. His fingers, calloused and strong, traced the line of her throat, stopping just where the dark ink of his own tattoo disappeared beneath his collar. The heat radiating from his hand was a shock to her skin. He wasn't cold, he was a furnace. Don't mistake discipline for weakness, he whispered, leaning down until his lips were inches from her ear. And never mistake my age for a lack of hunger. People see the suit and the silver at my temples, and they forget what I had to do to keep this throne. Imani's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had expected a grandfather, a man she could hide from or manage. But as Sunghyun's hand moved to her waist, his grip firm and possessive, she realized her mistake. The man who had bought her wasn't looking for a daughter to protect. He was looking for a wife to break. The physical tension between them was a live wire, and as he looked down at her with eyes that promised both protection and a beautiful gilded destruction, Imani realized she was standing on the edge of a truth she wasn't prepared to face. Sunghyun released her chin, but he didn't move away. Instead, he walked toward a small mahogany bar, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. The clink of the ice was the only sound in the room, sharp and final. He didn't look back at her as he spoke, but his voice carried a weight that made the walls of the suite feel like they were closing in. You think this is about a number on a ledger, Imani? You think your father simply lost some money? He turned, the glass held loosely in his hand. The golden light caught the edge of his jaw, making him look like a statue carved from shadows. Your father didn't just borrow money. He stole hope from men who don't believe in mercy. Kim Tae-won didn't just want the $300,000 back. He wanted a message. He wanted to send your father's head back to Kampala in a box to show what happens when a foreigner tries to play in our streets. Imani felt a cold shiver race down her spine. She thought of her father's weeping face in that hotel room, the way he couldn't meet her eyes. She had known it was bad, but she hadn't realized they were standing on the precipice of a massacre. I didn't just pay a debt, Sunghyun continued, stepping back into her personal space. The scent of the whiskey mingled with his sandalwood cologne. I bought the lives of your mother and your sisters. At this very moment, Taewon's men are being watched. If I hadn't stepped in, your family home would have been reduced to ash before the sun rose today. I didn't buy a bride, Imani. I purchased the survival of every person you love. He took a slow sip of the drink, his eyes never leaving hers. That is the price of your red and white silk. That is why your father bowed to me. He didn't see a son-in-law. He saw the only man in Korea powerful enough to call off the hounds. You are not here because of a wedding. You are here because you are the collateral that keeps them breathing. Imani felt the last of her defiance crumble. The luxury of the suite, the beautiful gown, the glittering city outside. It was all a lie. This wasn't a marriage. It was a ransom. She was the human seal on a contract written in blood. Every breath she took in this room was a breath her family was allowed to take back home. So, he whispered, setting the glass down on a side table and stepping so close she could feel the heat of his chest against her bodice. Tell me again how wrong this is. Tell me you'd rather be back in Kampala, watching your world burn, instead of being here with me. The silence that followed his revelation was thick, heavy with the weight of the lives he now held in his hands. Imani swallowed hard, her throat tight. She looked at the man before her, this powerful, disciplined enigma, and tried to find the spark of the young woman who had dreamed of a normal life in Kampala. She pulled her shoulders back, her voice barely a whisper but laced with a final, desperate flicker of defiance. I will stay, she said, her eyes searching his cold, gray gaze. I will be the wife you bought. But there are boundaries, Sunghyun. I am a human being, not a piece of furniture you can move at your whim. My life. My body. They are still mine. Sunghyun didn't flinch. Instead, a slow, dark smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, a look that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped into her personal space, the heat radiating from him making the air feel electric. He reached out, his thumb tracing the trembling line of her lower lip, a gesture that was terrifyingly intimate. Boundaries, he repeated, the word sounding foreign in his deep, gravelly voice. You talk as if this were a negotiation between equals, Imani. You seem to forget that a contract written in blood doesn't have fine print. He moved closer, his chest grazing the silk of her bodice, forcing her to look up at him. The power he radiated was suffocating, a physical force that demanded submission. You think you can dictate the terms of your own rescue. You are here because I will. You breathe because I allow it. Every secret you keep, every dream you hold, and every inch of this skin. They belong to the Choi name now. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear, his breath hot against her skin. I didn't bring you here to play house. I have needs that require a woman of your strength, your elegance, and your silence. Dark needs that the world outside this suite will never understand. You aren't just a wife, Imani. You are my legacy. You are my sanctuary. And in this house, there are no boundaries, only my will. He pulled back just enough to look into her wide, terrified eyes, his grip on her waist tightening until it was almost painful. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a branding. In that moment, the last of Imani's illusions vanished. She wasn't just a bride. She was his absolute possession. The weight of the pearl earrings no longer felt like a burden. They felt like armor. Imani looked past Sunghyun's shoulder at her reflection in the glass, and for the first time, she didn't see the girl who had spent her nights studying in Kampala or the daughter who had traveled to Seoul on a whim. That girl was gone, traded away in a hotel room for $300,000 and a promise of survival. In her place stood a woman wrapped in crimson and white, a woman who was now the primary stakeholder in a lethal empire. Sunghyun's hand remained on her waist, his thumb tracing a slow, rhythmic pattern against the silk. The heat of him was constant, a reminder that the protection he offered was inseparable from the power he wielded. He didn't just want her body or her presence. He wanted her to be the silent pillar at his side, the secret sanctuary for a man who lived a life of violence and shadows. The university in Kampala will send a letter soon, she said, her voice finally steady, devoid of the tremors that had defined her evening. They will ask why I haven't returned. Let them ask, Sunghyun replied, his eyes dark with a sudden fierce pride as he watched her composure settle. Your education will continue here, in the boardrooms and the backrooms of Seoul. You will learn a different kind of history, Imani. You will learn how the world is actually run. He walked her toward the edge of the suite, where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. Below them, the lights of Seoul pulsed like a living heart, a heart that beat to the rhythm of his commands. Now it would beat to hers as well. She realized then that she was no longer a victim of the underground. She was its new queen. The gilded cage was still a cage, but it was one that sat atop the highest peak in the country. She looked at the intricate tattoo on his neck and then at the wedding band on her own finger. The transition was complete. To save her family, she had stepped into the dark, and to her surprise, the dark had opened its arms to welcome her. She leaned back almost imperceptibly into his strength, accepting the claim he had laid upon her. The daughter of Marcus Cole was a memory. The wife of Choi Sunghyun was a reality. As the city lights flickered in the distance, Imani closed her eyes and let the girl she used to be slip away into the night. She was no longer waiting for a rescue. She was the one who had survived.